Welcome back, everyone. This is Ayad Boudiab, and we are continuing our discussion with AngularJS. One item that we've been discussing recently has to do with the directives and creating our own custom directives. I showed you an example earlier on how we can create that, and I was referring to a student controller with the student directive, and I was displaying the name of the student and the actual course, and that was it. And we also basically down here we used the attribute to indicate what we're working with, right? But in this case, I'm trying to show you something different, how we can add more than one element into the scope, and also how we can use the element directive, custom directive, instead of the attribute. Okay, so there are a couple of changes that we'll have to make. The first thing that we need to look into, first of all, is the scope. We have in here scope.james. Let's add one more element into the scope in here. So $scope and then .lisa, and then that will be equal to, and then we indicate the name, and that will be Lisa, and then after that we indicate the course, and let's say that would be getting started with Angular. Okay, so this basically adds two elements to the scope. We have the ng app, we have the module, they match, we have the controller, here as part of the ng controller for the div. All right, and then on the controller we have named student controller, we use the scope, and then we have adding a couple elements into the scope, James and Lisa as part of that. So this pretty much the two elements that I want to add. So I'm done with this section. Now the second thing that I'm interested in is basically the actual directive that I'm working with and how I can manipulate my HTML down here to work with an element instead of an attribute. So two changes, 1, 2. Let's go ahead and create the actual HTML changes. That way you have an idea on what we need to change up here in the directive itself. So within the div, I'm going to create an element called my student, and that should match with the one down here, right? So this is my student in camel case, this is my dash student as an element, and then this has some type of attribute in here called contact, and we'll see how we can change that. And that contact in here is James, and this, as you see, this James here seems to match with the James part here at the scope, so we'll see how we can change that shortly. And then I'm going to close that slash my student. I'm going to copy this because I need to create one for Lisa as well. Down here I'm going to create an HR. Let's make sure we fix that properly, and then let's paste the one for Lisa. So let's do that here. Now I have two element directives, my student, one for James, one for Lisa. So then the second thing is, what else do I need to make in order for this to work, right? Up in the directive, we need to specify what is an element versus an attribute, right? And this is indicated through restrict. And here when you say restrict and you specify the value, I can use C for class, I can use A for attribute, I can use the E for element. Since I'm working with an element right now, I'm going to indicate E, but don't forget to put a comma afterwards because these are like key value pairs separated with comma. The second thing that I need to indicate is, what does that mean in here, contact, right? So I need to indicate in here the scope. That's my second option. For the scope, there will be an object, and again, don't forget in here before you after you close, you put a comma that represent restrict, scope, template. These are the three values within the return. Within the scope, I'm going to use my student contact, right? That's the contact that I have down here. So when I have contact.name and contact.course, the contact in here is James. James has a name and a course, and the contact in here is Lisa. Lisa has a name and a course. So in this case, then, for my student contact, I will indicate the value is, and then in quotation, the syntax looks as follows. You use the equal sign first, and then you put the actual value, which is contact. So now we have everything tied together as far as the scope is concerned. If I didn't want to do this, then for every one of those part of the scope, I'll be creating another controller. So controller 1 be James, controller 2 be Lisa. That'll be too much, right? So in this case, then we can eliminate that redundancy using the scope. Within the scope, I indicate what my value is for the attribute, in this case contact, and then of course my student element is elaborated here with the restrict as E instead of A for attributes. Let's go ahead and save that, and let's see if that would display on the page. And you see that the name is James, course intro to programming, and then Lisa, getting started with Angular separated with a HR. So that's how I can work with actual custom directives, but in this case using elements instead of attributes. Now the next item that I want to talk about is another example from the Angular website that talks about events and how we can handle those events and how we can tie them with the custom directives. I found this helpful, and I'll use that as more discussion for you, so we can look at the code and try to understand it. That way you can be more familiar with it and how we can create custom directives. So let's go to this, and in here, custom directives 4. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to create a new page here, display it, and we should be able to see drag me, and when I drag this, it's being dragged, right? So I'm able to drag some type of element on the screen. So there must be some type of events, right? Let's go ahead and look at that example and see what it means to us. Okay, so going back here, I have my ng app called custom directive app, and that's part of the angular.module that you see here, custom directive app. I have a reference to the script. I haven't changed anything in there. And then inside the body, again, this body is part of the Angular website. I got that from the Angular website. I did not make any changes to it. The custom directive app does not depend on anything, no dependency, therefore empty square brackets. I'm going to create a directive, and then that's all, right? And if I scroll down here into the body, I see that in the body I have a span tag. That span has my draggable as an attribute. Therefore, I'm using attribute type of directive in here instead of element like you saw in the previous example. And the text of that says drag me. So nothing fancy. As you've seen before, I can use custom directives as attributes, custom directives as elements. In this case, we're using the attributes. Let's go ahead and look at the code and see how we can make those changes for that dragging to take place. Now, we create the directive called my draggable, and you see my with a draggable capital D. I look down here, it says my dash draggable. Therefore, the naming makes sense, right? And how we can name the attribute inside the HTML5 body, and how we can name that directive when we create it inside Angular. Okay, now the actual directive depends on the document service, right? And then we pass that document as part of the function, right? Like we always do. Remember when, let's say, it depends on the scope, we pass the scope, and so on. We've seen this in the previous example. The other thing is, in the previous example, I showed you that you can create your directive and you say return and link, and you specify your link function. In this case, we just return the function right away. We didn't have to create a separate function and then return it. In this case, we say, here's the function that you need. We can do this. Different variations, right? But the key part is that this function, like the other one, takes the scope, the element, and the attribute, right? Like we've discussed before. These are three key parts of the function that this directive would need. The scope is the normal scope that you're working with. The element is the element you're manipulating. Is the attribute is the key value pair of attributes that you can be working with. Inside that function, we have some variables being declared: the start x and the start y, x and y, and they're all initialized to zeros. Simple JavaScript declaration, right? Now the element that you're working with, that is in here, drag me, that element that you're working with is basically passed in as a parameter, so you can do things to it, right? Okay, well, one thing that I can do to this element is apply the CSS, and we can do such things because, as I said in previous discussion, Angular also relies on jQuery Lite, so I can use jQuery type of functionality to change things. So in this case, then, we are changing the CSS of that element. And the way we do this is by passing an object as a parameter. That object has key value pairs. And in the key value pairs, you indicate what you want. The position for the CSS is relative. The border is 1 pixel solid red, right? It's 1 pixel solid red. That's the border. You see some grayish background. You see that when I hover over it, you see the hand sign, right? So in this case, then the background color is light gray, and then the cursor is the pointer. Okay, so that makes sense to what you see right now on the screen. And you were able to do this because element is automatically provided to you as a parameter. That's part of the link function that takes the scoped element and the attribute as a parameter, as parameters. All right. Now what else we need to do? We're dealing with events, right? Okay, so we say element on means what happens on that specific element, right? Again, the element that's passed in as a parameter. The element on mouse down, I'm going to trigger a function. I'm going to prevent the defaults that usually happen on a mouse down. Okay, and prevent defaults is part of the event being passed in as a parameter. So I'm going to prevent the defaults. I'm going to calculate my starting x, which is I can get by event.pageX, and then subtract the x value from it. X value right now is 0. And then start y, which is the y position, is the event.pageY minus the y. Since y, x, and y's are zeros, that's just pretty much what the values are within the event page x and page y. Now, I'm using also the document, and here that's the document service, and I'm asking the document on mouse down, I want you to call this function, and on mouse up, I want you to call this function. That's part of the document, right? So for that specific element, on mouse down, prevent defaults, but I want you to tie the mouse down, mouse up, and mouse move and mouse up to these two functions. Mouse move is tied to mouse move, and here's the body for mouse move. And then mouse up is tied to mouse up, and here's the body down here. All right, now when the mouse move is taking place, I'm going to, of course, having event as parameter, I'm going to get the page y and subtract the start y from it, page x to subtract the start x from it to get the xy value, and then I'm going to update the element's CSS, right? And the top would be the y pixels because that's the new value that I have calculated, and then the left would be the x pixels. That's the new value that I have calculated. Of course, in pixels. That's why you see in here plus px. All right, so that takes care of the mouse move event, right? And then down here, we have the mouse up. On the mouse up, I want to turn things off, right? So when the user takes has the mouse up event, I'm going to turn off the mouse move, and then the same thing for the mouse up, right? And I'm using the document service being passed into me as a parameter that the actual directive depends on, right? And remember, the directive declaration or the dependency starts here, and then you see it being closed down here. Okay, so when we put that in here, we automatically start writing the function that takes the document as a parameter. So that's how I can work with events as far as Angular is concerned when creating custom directives. Another thing that you can do, like we've done before, we can always load the developer tools. So I can go to Tools, Developer Tools. I can look at my page taking place in here with the actual code, and then here's the body, right? Here's the CSS, here's the on mouse down, and here's the mouse move. I can click here, create an event, reload the page, okay, and then move something, and then it stops at that breakpoint. I can ask the page Y value, it's 13. I can ask the page X value, it's 41. And then, of course, in this case, the start X and start Y are pretty much the same value. So XY would represent 0 because it's still in the original corner position. And then, of course, I can use in here my my actions on the right hand side to basically step over, step into, and so on. So I can step through my code and figure out what's going on. Okay, so I hope this discussion on custom directives has been helpful to you. We looked at multiple examples from the Angular website. We created our own example and discussed its details. And we also, the key point as well is that we loaded all this in the F12 developer tools. That way we can have a better understanding of what's going on. So every time you see something that doesn't make sense, get a breakpoint, put it there, and step through the code. I'm going to move on to other subjects. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Ayad Boudia, and you